Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to look at Unit 9, Notes B, which is about the First World War, and we're going to really get into the first major conflict of the 20th century here and how the United States is or really isn't involved as much as we thought. Now, if you haven't had a chance to finish the end of Notes A with Dollar Diplomacy, make sure you do that, please, by looking up the notes on Google Drive. However, today what we really want to look at is now that we understand the United States is industrialized and we understand that the United States is now looking to spread its influence throughout the world in places like Hawaii, Philippines, Cuba, and many other areas that we talked about, we now look at the impact of that, and that's war. Unfortunately, when countries start to move out and expand and look towards taking other territories for their own benefit, that's going to lead to conflict. So when we look at World War One, it's probably a war we know something about. It's probably one that's not as familiar as World War Two, and there's a reason for that. Of course, World War One was called the war to end all wars, as it was the first really modernized type of warfare. And so we'll get into what that looks like. And we start by looking at the causes. The very first cause of World War One is going to be militarism. Militarism is the idea that military power just expanded so rapidly during the late 1800s. We spent a lot of time in the Industrial Revolution talking about the technological advantages of steel and railroads and all of these great things like a light bulb. And we didn't really get into how that impacts our military, but the military is always going to be on the cutting edge of all of those inventions. And just so you can visually see it, here is a U.S. ship in the 1700s, very small. You can see relatively few amount of cannons on the side. In the late 1800s, I know this has a British flag on it, but it's a good example of a ship. You can now see it's larger. It's got three main masts. It's got three rows of cannons on the side, on both sides, so it can do a broadside shot on either one. These are these were the modern day battleships probably in a post-Civil War. But now as we get into the 1900s, battleships are going to start looking like this. And these cannons and turrets on the side of a battleship are going to be able to shoot miles away. And it's going to change how warfare looks and how it operates. So that's the first one, is M, is militarism. Second is alliances. Alliances refer to military agreements that committed countries to one another. Simply put, friendships. Now, alliances are finicky. Alliances are tricky because oftentimes, alliances can be honored, but only if they're in the best interest of the individual. So the problem and the reason that alliances led to World War One is that many countries had alliances with other countries, but they did not make it public to which countries they were actually aligned with, and we'll see how that plays out here. Third is imperialism. We've talked a lot about imperialism. This is, that international bullying concept about trying to get out and take other countries. Certainly Europe did a lot of this during the 1800s in the scramble for Africa. You can see a lot of the French appear on the western side of Africa. The British kind of did this straight cut down through the heart, all in red. And then the Belgians and the Portuguese and many other countries were involved in that as well. And it led countries to really be competitive over how much land they could take and how much power they had. Now, the United States did not get involved in this scramble for Africa. If I go back here, we looked more towards the Pacific Islands and Asia and some of the places even in Latin America for our taking. But everybody was competing with one another. And when you have competition, competition can be healthy. But competition can also promote, fiercity between countries. And in this case, we call that competitive edge. We call it nationalism because nationalism is this idea that, your nation is not only better, but that your nation is superior in every shape and form. Nationalism is patriotism on steroids. You might remember that conversation we had the first week of the year. Nationalism can be used to bring countries together, but when it's used as an outward force, it can be a little scary. A great example here is this Sphinx. You might recognize this from Egypt. You notice here it's missing the nose. And that nose is a pretty popular story, is missing because in the 1800s when Napoleon led a group of French troops down into Egypt to fight the British, they used these sphinxes as target practice. And I point that out because that's really what nationalism is. That even though this is an incredible archaeological artifact, and finding, the Napoleon, because he exhibited traits of nationalism, did not care, and they used it for target practice instead of respecting the historical marker that it is. And so nationalism, guys, emerged, and nationalism might be the most important piece here in the 1900s because at the beginning of the 1900s, the old Ottoman Empire that you see here in red, blue, yellow, this used to all be one conjoined empire. And we called it the Ottoman Empire. It had been around for hundreds of years. And by the 1900s, however, the Ottoman Empire had slowly but surely dissolved. And they had kind of retracted to just being in and around Turkey. And it led to a lot of these areas starting to want some of their own independence. Areas like Bosnia, Albania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece. They were looking towards regaining some of their independence as the Ottoman Empire started to cease in power, or at least lose some of its influence. Now, that led to then, in 1914, the heir to the Austrian throne. I'll show you again where Austria is. Here's Austria. Here's Serbia, just for your reference. The Archduke of Austria, who was in line to maybe take over some of this territory and take over some of Serbia now that the Ottomans had lost their control. He was on a goodwill tour, if you will, or a kind of a hello tour around some of the territories that he was going to take when he was assassinated by a young man named Gavrilo Princip. And if you're writing in your notes right now, you might want to add that this really was the spark of the war. This man, Gavrilo Princip, basically walked up to Archduke Franz Ferdinand, shot him in the chest several times, and killed him. And he was Serbian. Archduke was Austrian. And when this happened, Austria was furious. Again, here's Austria. They were furious about what had happened. And they issued an ultimatum to Serbia that they had to not only apologize, but they had to essentially give in and give control over to Austria immediately. Now, the government of Serbia was kind of taken aback by this because, Gavrilo Princip had acted on his own, or at least that's what historical records tell us. And the government didn't feel like they were responsible for a lone gunman's activities. And so Serbia denied this. Now, it didn't hurt that Serbia also knew, and this is where it gets tricky, folks, that if they went to war with Austria, that Russia had already signed an alliance with them. And so Serbia felt pretty confident that if Austria attacked them, Russia was going to respect their alliance and come in and help them. Now, to make matters even more interesting, Russia had an alliance with France. And all of a sudden, Austria-Hungary feels a little bit outmanned, and they let everybody else know that they had an alliance with Germany. So overnight, what started between one Serbian assassin and the Austrian-Hungary prince has now evolved into a war between Serbia, Russia, and France versus Austria and Germany. And for several months, as these two sides begin to mobilize for war, it looks like a pretty fair fight. Now, in a preemptive attack, Germany decided they were going to invade France. They felt like if they could take Paris quickly, that they could then focus all of their power and their might on Russia, which took time to mobilize because of its massive population. But what Germany didn't know is when they invaded France, France had an alliance with Britain. And it's just a crazy web here of alliances that led all these countries in green to attack all the countries in red. Now, the Ottoman Empire does come in here later, but they're relatively they're not as important maybe as Austria and Germany are in the entire piece here. And so at the end, here's our two sides. We have the Allies. You'll notice that's the same name as the Allies in World War II. And it's Britain, France, and Russia. Now, you'll notice in the parentheses it says until 1917. Russia is actually going to drop out of this war due to their own problems. And that's when the United States is going to come in. So the United States is not initially involved in World War I. In fact, we're only there for about 1 out of the 4 years. And we'll talk more about how that idea works. Now, on the other side, we have the Central Powers. Now, notice, not the Axis powers, that's World War II, but the Central Powers, and that's Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. As for the war itself, though, folks, This in World War I is really where we start to see what modernized warfare looks like and how scary some of this is. The German army thought that they could invade France quickly. They felt like their technological innovations were better than anybody else. And they ran into France very quickly here, right on the eastern side of France. They invaded through Belgium and into France. And as soon as they got into France, they were hit with some very harsh resistance by the French. Because what the French had done is they had dug themselves down into these trenches, as you can see on this previous slide, and really prepared themselves for a defensive type of warfare. We've seen this before. We saw this at the Battle of St. Petersburg when Ulysses S. Grant tried to siege that city and how long that battle took. But the lessons probably had not translated over yet into the European theater, and a long stalemate ensued. What happened was basically generals started to realize that their ability to wage war was massively impacted by the technological innovations of the 1900s. That to send men out into an open area against machine guns and mustard gas and all these new innovations basically meant suicide. And so what happened in these trenches that are built along this green line is that a lot of troops just sat and waited and waited and waited. And every now and then they were ordered to go, and it was almost always a massacre. It was just a terrible situation anytime one side tried to charge. And for the majority of the war, for 4 years, this line never moved more than 30 miles in either direction. It's essentially a stalemate. And that's what trench warfare really looks like, folks, is that all of these machines cause people to rely more on their weapons and less on the manpower of their actual army. And so both sides are going to lose hundreds of thousands of men. We had never seen anything like this. The Civil War, we lost many American lives, but there were more men lost on this Western Front in World War I than all of the Civil War combined. And it's just a horrifying experience because for the average soldier, they were living in the trenches. The trenches were muddy and wet. They became rat infested. There were diseases in the trenches. In some of the worst cases, they even got exposed to chemical warfare for the first time. Chemical warfare can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes chemicals can attack your nervous system, which would be the worst case scenario. Other times it could give you third-degree burns, or it could be poison mass. Now, only less than 3% of the war's 10 million casualties actually died from this, but the threat of it made men always be wearing gas masks, and it was just a miserable existence for the men that were in those trenches. You might ask yourself, well, where's the U.S. in all of this? Well, by 1914, when the war broke out, folks, we still were declaring neutrality. We felt like this wasn't our war, that we didn't feel like we needed to get involved in it. And honestly, if Europe kind of beat up on itself, I'm sure there were some thoughts in our minds that maybe that would be beneficial for us. So we decided to get economically involved, and we supported the British because of our natural ties to them. But we did not send any troops over there because we didn't feel like it was our problem. So as we were trading with the British throughout the war, we started to send supplies by ship to the British, and it worked for a while until a very newly invented submarine by the Germans called a U-boat proved to be kind of a menace for us. And these submarines, which couldn't be seen, because as we hadn't invented, some reliable radar yet, were sinking U.S. ships before they could even get into Britain, and it became a problem for us. So we warned the Germans. We said, hey, if you sink any ships that have American lives on them, you will be held accountable for that. And we made sure that, they knew what was a passenger ship versus what was a military ship or what was a cargo ship. And for a while it worked. But in May 7th of 1915, the Germans sank a British passenger ship called the Lusitania. And the Lusitania had 1,200 civilians on it. 128 of them were American. The rest were mostly British. And this was a terrible calamity because in the eyes of the public, this looks like the Germans targeted passengers, commoners. and killed them out in open daylight. It was later proven that even though the United States had issued that warning to Germany and told them not to attack any passenger ships, that we were in fact lying about what we had on the bottom of the ship, and we were putting war supplies in there and using the passengers as a cover up. I mean, if that happened in today's world, that would look really, really bad. Um, but we don't find that out until later. And on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson finally really, brings our country into war. And check out what he says. He says, "The world must be made safe for democracy. The world, its peace must be planted upon tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest and no dominion." Um, Very different than what the imperialist notion was before that. Very anti-imperialistic and very positive. Now, what we'll have to see then is, does he in fact keep his word? And does the United States not view this as an opportunity to become ultimately very involved in the world process? So we are neutral at first. We don't come into the war until 1917, and then the war is going to be over by 1918. So that is the first half of Notes B. At this point, we will finish the rest in class.